Alright, hey guys. So today we're gonna look at the theory called the Mundell-Fleming Model, which is a pretty central aspect to macroeconomic theory, which especially advanced macroeconomic theory, and it has some really interesting implications for um, making different policy-related applications in economics. And so the Mundell-Fleming model essentially consists of three different curves, but I have written down the two that are the bigger determinants here, and we'll look at the third one in a sec. And so the first one that you have is the IS curve, where also net exports is included. So you have that income or output is dependent upon consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. In this case, we're going to assume that output is strictly positive, dependent upon consumption, um, government spending, and net exports, whereas it is declining in investment, or the real interest rate as I minus the expected inflation. Um, we further have that it also depends negative upon the tax, so T, and that um, also in the net exports variable, we have also the exchange rate as E included, and then the price ratio. And then the second curve is the LM curve, where we have money supply and money demand are in equivalent terms. So on the left-hand side, we have the money supply, and then we have the money demand on the right-hand side, which is negatively dependent upon the interest rate, whereas it is positively dependent upon the national income or output. And so for the Mundell-Fleming model, there are two specific conditions that we're going to want to look at specifically, where the first one relates to the state of capital mobility. So capital mobility refers to how assets move across borders. So when there is perfect capital mobility, we assume that assets move perfectly across borders without any transaction cost, tax, or any other cost, which of course is a very idealistic scenario, but well, not usually representative of the truth. Whereas um, in imperfect capital mobility, well, there are different transaction costs and whatnot that influence the flow of capital. Um, the second condition is the exchange rate. So the government or the central bank may assume either a fixed or a flexible exchange rate, which is highly important as we look at the different cases here that we're going to be dealing with. So looking at the first case that we're considering here in this video, we're looking at a monetary expansion with fixed rates and perfect capital mobility. So we can see the graph here about what is happening, but let's try to look in depth and explain what happens when the central bank decides to increase the monetary supply under fixed exchange rates and perfect capital mobility. So looking at our LM curve, we can see that an increase in the money supply will cause the LM curve to shift outward to the right. So we can see here that it's shifting outward, so from LM over to LM prime, so the second red LM line here. The effect of this, when there's an increase in the money supply, so this one goes up, well, what happens then? Well, we can see that the interest rate is negatively dependent upon on the money supply, the real money supply. So in turn, the interest rate will decrease and the output will go up. So we can see that here the interest rate is lower below the BOP, so the balance of payments curve, where when the BOP is in equilibrium, we have that the interest rate is equal to the equilibrium interest rate. And so when there's an increase in the money supply, the LM curve shifts outwards and the interest rate falls. So it goes down to here, whereas output increases, which is logical if you think about it, because if there's a lower interest rate, people have more money on hand and they will spend more. Um, so when the interest rate falls, what happens then? Well, because the interest rate falls, people or investors will look at other markets where the interest rates are higher to buy bonds in order to earn more money earn more interest on their own money, um, which leads to a massive capital outflow. And hence, the domestic residents will purchase foreign currency, which puts upward pressure on the exchange rate. So they purchase foreign currency in order to buy foreign bonds and that is where the capital outflow happens. So what happens then is that the exchange rate goes up because they buy a lot of the um, foreign currency. Well, the effect of this is that because we're under a fixed exchange rate regime here, the central bank is forced um, to um, to try to keep the exchange rate at its original level. And so, in order to get the exchange rate back to the original level, the central bank will have to purchase domestic currency to reduce their own money supply and support the exchange rate. In this way, because they reduce the money supply by purchasing foreign currency or purchasing domestic currency, we have a scenario where the LM curve shifts back. So because the money supply decreases, then the interest rate will go back up and then output will go back down. And we end up back at the same spot we were at in the first place. So we can see that output or initial income will equal the stage 2 output or income. And so what we can conclude here is that because we end up in the same spot as we did in the beginning, well, we can pretty much conclude that the expansionary monetary policy is completely ineffective in this case. So in the case that you have fixed exchange rates and perfect capital mobility, it does not really make sense to use monetary expansions. Moving on to the second case, we have a monetary expansion with flexible rates and perfect capital mobility. So again, we have a monetary expansion. So the result of this, again, is that the money supply will increase because the central bank decides to increase the money supply, again causing the LM curve in the same way as in the previous case here, the LM curve will shift out towards the right. Again, in the same way as in the previous example, we will see that the interest rate as a result falls, um, which leads to a massive capital outflow. Then again, just as in the last case, we will have that foreign or domestic residents will purchase foreign currency in order to earn more interest, which puts an upward pressure on the exchange rate, as we can see over here. When there's an upward pressure on the exchange rate, we can see that because the exchange rate is positively correlated with net exports, an increase in the exchange rate will lead to an increased amount of exports. This ultimately ends up shifting the IS curve to the right. Because we have flexible rates, the central bank is not forced to try to get the interest or the exchange rate back to its original level. So it can just let the economy float with the changed exchange rate. And so there's an increase in net exports, causing the IS curve also to shift outwards to the right. And so with this new shift, it shifts out to here. There is a new intersection here between the LM curve and the IS curve. And here at this point, we can see that, well, output is higher, both higher than the intermediate stage, but also much higher than in the first place. And the interest rate has not changed, so it ends up being in the exact same spot as the last place. In this case, the expansionary monetary policy is therefore really effective. And so the both the output or income has increased, but the exchange rate has also depreciated without affecting the interest rate. So moving on to our last case, we can see a fiscal expansion with fixed rate and an imperfect capital mobility. Now, this is a bit of a more interesting case because here we have that the balance of payments curve, due to the imperfect capital mobility, is actually sloping upwards. Also, as opposed to the previous cases, we're going to look at a fiscal expansion with fixed rates and imperfect capital mobility. So let's move our equations over here just to keep track of what we're doing. Okay, cool. So now we have it all summed up here. Well, let's consider what happens here. So first of all, we have a fiscal expansion. Well, what is a fiscal expansion? Well, it's an increase in government spending, so G goes up. Since Y is positively dependent upon G, so output is positively related to government spending, we have that the IS curve shifts out to the right. So we can see here that the IS curve has an outward shift along the balance of payments curve. Well, looking at our BOP curve here, we can see that when it shifts out to here at first, we have the intermediate stage or the first movement. We can see that the interest rate will increase up to this level here, and also the output will increase substantially relative to the original output. Well, what happens here is that because the interest rate goes up, there will be a massive inflow in capital, and we have an inflow in capital simply because the exchange or the interest rate is higher. People will want to buy our bonds in our domestic currency, to receive more interest on their money relative to what they could in their own countries. And so because they purchase domestic currency, there is a resulting downward push on the exchange rate. So the exchange rate goes down, which also in turn increases our net exports. However, because the exchange rate is fixed, the central bank will have to sell domestic currency in order to get the money supply back up, and therefore increase the exchange rate. Therefore, because they buy because they sell domestic currency in order to fix the money supply, we can see that the LM curve shifts out. So there's an increase here in the money supply, and actually we end up at this final stage here, where it is somewhat higher in output than the intermediate case, and it is relatively higher than the output or the original output case. What's interesting here is that because we're in this imperfect capital mobility phase, well, we have that because capital cannot move freely, as we discussed in the beginning. It can't move freely without transaction costs and different fees. Actually, these increases in government spending and this increase in the money supply from the central bank actually is less effective, because when money is transferred across borders, a little of it is lost every single time, simply because there are transaction costs present. And so what we have here, what we end up with is we can see that the fiscal policy is relatively effective. But if we compare this to our last case, so case 2 over here, we can see that we essentially have the same movements. However, because of this imperfect capital mobility case, we're actually less effective than if there's perfect capital mobility. So every single time some of the money is sent across the border, we lose a little bit of money in transaction costs or taxes, and that causes it to be slightly less efficient than in the case, or in the idealistic case where there would be no taxes or transaction costs. However, we do end up in a somewhat better situation, and This is because the interest rate is now higher than before the fiscal expansion. So there is a summary for you about three different cases from the Mundell-Fleming model. There are some different adjustments that you can make to this. For example, you might want to look at a fiscal expansion with flexible rates and perfect capital mobility. But by using this logic that we have used in these graphs and also using these equations, you should be able to apply this to your own potential scenario that you might have. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.